connecting with God. It's a topic which has been, it's not a recent thing, it's something that's been going on for thousands of years. There's always been, from the beginning of human existence, this idea of there is something bigger, because there are things that happen in our world that we cannot explain. And it's not a Christian thing or a Jewish thing or an Islamic thing. It's just this thing that people go, I want to connect with the thing that is bigger than me. Now, we get the privilege now, sitting here in Australia, 2,000 years after Jesus, to have a pretty good look back through history and see the impact of Christianity and other faiths and everything. And what I hope for you this morning is that if you are someone who follows Jesus, that after today you'll have an opportunity to go and say, am I connecting with God in the way that works for me? And if you're someone who you're not quite sure whether Jesus is worth trusting yet, then you can look at some ways that we decide that we like to connect with God. And maybe it might give you a little bit of insight as to whether following Jesus is for you. Last week we started our series by looking at the fact that who we spend time with shapes us and the experience we have in this life. And we looked at a passage in Mark where Jesus went and spent time with God and exampled for everyone following him that spending time with God allows us to be shaped like God. So we started off in that space there. And this week we're going to go to an Old Testament narrative, one that's well known, that talks about the idea that sometimes when the clothes just don't fit, we need to make sure we're wearing the right thing. Now, before we get into all of that, if you doze off or check out early, here's the big takeaway for today, okay? So I get it, big weekend, you got a million things on. You're all very busy people, I get that. So if you need to tap out, here's the big idea for today, okay? You have been made, I believe, to experience life with God. To experience life with your Heavenly Father. And maybe, just maybe, the reason it feels so hard to connect with Him is because of the way that you've been trying to do it. And today we're going to give you a tool, and if you do need to tap out on the in the handout, we haven't had handouts for ages. On the sermon notes at the back there, there's a little assessment that I'm going to encourage you to do at some point, and if you get really bored, just do it then. No one will judge you. I think you're on the Bible app anyway, so go for it. All right. So that's what we're going to look at today. How it is that we connect with God. And before we get to our passage, I just want to take us to a little bit of a weird spot and it'll come out fun. I want to talk about driving, I want to talk about going to the toilet, and I want to talk about queuing up for lines. Is that okay? All right. I don't know if you're aware of this, but you do have a driving face. Has anyone, when you're driving, observed other drivers' driving face? You got the nose pickers, the throat checkers, off in the distance, you got the people who are like singing along like no one's watching. You got the people who look like, are you paying attention? Because some people I watch when I'm driving past, I'm like, get home safely. Other people are having this I think it's an argument. You see them they're like rage going through like some sort of anger fantasy that definitely needs therapeutic help. And they're just like going through that conversation with the boss or the spouse or the friend. And everyone has a driving way that they drive. It's just what happens. For those of us that get to drive, or if you've driven before, you have a face, you have a way that you do it. We all do it a little bit differently. Sort of like going to the toilet, right? Okay. So we all go to the toilet a little differently. Some of you, you take your phone in there and it's like, goodbye world, I'll be back when I get out of here. For some of you, you just take it as an opportunity to snooze. You get those people, they just get on there and they just have a good old kip. Some of you are like, no phones, no distractions, 2 minutes in, out, done. Good on you. Others, I don't know what it is, but you're freaking out that anyone hears you as though you're the only person to ever poop in all of history. But if someone hears you fart, so help me, you get freaked out. Anyway, in lines. Have you ever noticed when people queue up in lines, they all have a bit of a different thing? Some of you love watching people, you're queuing up in line. You don't mind it's taking time, you're just enjoying. Oh, that looks interesting. An ensemble. Don't know if I would wear that. Some of you guys are just, as soon as there's a line, you're like, phone out, and just you need to be distracted. Others of you, you're sitting there. If everyone just paid attention and not know what's on the menu, it's on the wall. And some of you are like, just come on, hurry up. There's things we get to do in this life that are just human experiences, but we all do them very, very differently. It's a little bit of what makes us us, is those little things that we get to do and participate in that make us, our personality, the way we choose to do it, the way we think, the way we act, the way we feel, the way we emote. We are complex, beautiful people with all of these different factors that make us who we are and make us us. We have our own style. Sometimes things fit really well. Like sometimes you get to a new workplace and it's just like, this is it. This is where I'm meant to be. Sometimes you go to a workplace and you think it's a fit, and after 2 weeks you look around and go, this isn't quite right. Some of us with hobbies, you try a hobby and you're like, whoa, no, that is not for me. I thought that was for me. And if you've got, if you're neurodiverse, or if you are someone who fixates, sometimes they'll be like I do at times. I get like the hobby, I buy the things, then I try the hobby, and then I find out whether I like it or not. Smart person would try the hobby, find out whether they like it or not, save their money, time, and energy, and then figure out what they're doing. So, we all try different things. Sometimes I get into a hobby, I'm like, yes. Other times I'm like, no. For some of us with relationships, when we have relationships, we get into a relationship and it just felt wrong. And we get out of that relationship. Then we get into another relationship and we think it feels right or more right, but it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. It's just, and then, you don't know what the future holds going forward. We are all wired beautifully differently. There are some things that just fit us really well, and there's some things that say. But 3,000 years ago, there is a story that comes from the Bible about a young man named David and a giant called Goliath. So very quickly, if you are from church world, if you've grown up, you're deep church, and you understand the story, David and Goliath is just a staple, right? Who doesn't like the little guy getting up there with his things and destroying the giant? Not from church world, or you didn't know this story comes from the Bible. We get the story from the book of 1 Samuel. And it's even something that's used in business, David versus Goliath, when the little guy takes down the big guy. This is all from a story that comes to us from the Bible. Now, just a bit of background as we get into the story, just to help set the context for what's happening today, just a few things. So it is a biblical text that many have heard of, but maybe not everybody. And this is sort of what's happening at the time. David is going to go and beat Goliath. But there's a context as to why this young man is going to go and try and verse this big giant with a massive sword. The context is this. The nation of Israel, not to be confused with modern day Israel, this is ancient Israel, at the time appointed themselves a king because they wanted someone to be in charge of them. Before that, they listened to the people, they listened to God, and God would raise up these people called judges. And the judges would come in at a time, go to the people and say, hey everyone, just so you're aware, God who is leading you wants you to be acting like this, but at the moment you're doing the wrong thing. And so the judge would come along, help them out, free them, redirect them, then the people would get sort of right for a time, and then of course they'd fall back into things. And we call it the cycle of the judges. The people of Israel who were meant to be following God did the right thing, fell over, God sent a judge, put them back straight, they rose up, they fell over, and it's just again and again and again. And eventually, the people of God said, you know what? This judge thing is okay, but what would be really cool, because every other nation has one, is a king. And God said, no kings. And the people went, Samuel, can you go and ask again? Because he said no last time, but maybe he'll change his mind. So they go to Samuel, they say, hey, Samuel, we're disappointed about this decision. Can you go back to God and just double check for us? Samuel goes back to God again and says they really want a king. And God says, okay, I'll give them a king, but just make sure they understand what comes with a king. Because before this, when they were under God, they had a different leadership style. When it comes to a king, there's a couple of things that will change. It means that the people at the top will be well looked after, and there will be more poverty for those underneath. Kings will want to fight wars to defend themselves and everything, and you'll be dragged into conflicts that I probably wouldn't take you into. And so just double check they're okay with that. And if they do, they can have a king. Something happens later, similar with the temple. They want a temple. God says no, they go and get a temple. It's almost like, if you just beg God enough, maybe he'll give in. So parents, when your kid comes up and they're just they ask you and you're like, no. Then they ask again and you're like, no. And then they ask again and again, you're like, fine, just take the thing. And then you move on. Anyway, so they go up to God, they get their king that they want. And the king that they appoint is a guy called Saul. And Saul is the king at the time. And Saul is battling, the nation is battling with the nation of Philistines. So the Philistines are someone who they've had a long history with. So this is not a new conflict for the people of Israel at the time. This is something which has been going on for a long time, and Saul is now heading up the charge to beat them. And in this particular moment of history, the Philistines have got this really cool guy called Goliath, who's really tall, and they're basically taunting the Israelites. The Philistines are saying, you guys are unable to beat us, and look at this big giant that we have. There's no way you can beat him. And the giant would come out and yell at these Israelites and say, you guys are nothing, your God is nothing, and you will never be able to defeat us. And the Israelites are hiding, and they're unsure what to do, and they're afraid. And Saul thinks to himself, I can motivate these guys. All right, everyone, whoever can take down that giant, I'll give you gold, you'll get glory, and you can even have my daughter's hand in marriage. So he did that, and people were still like, I'm not versing him. And they're hanging back. So one day, David gets sent along to go check on his brothers who are there at the fight. And he rocks up and he looks at the situation. And this young guy who's a shepherd at the time, he looks around and goes, this doesn't seem much like a battle. And he learns very quickly, they're very scared. And he goes to them, why are you guys scared? Like, we've got God on our side. Surely God can go for us and we can overtake this enemy. Now, as David's going around and trying to figure out the situation, his brothers get niggly with him, and you can go read it in 1 Samuel chapter 17. But his brothers are getting niggly with him and saying, what are you doing here? Go back out of here. And he's like, well, you guys don't seem to be doing anything. Maybe you need a little bit of motivation. And then he hears there's a reward. Now, scholars say David is purely motivated by God. And I agree he's motivated about God's reputation. However, it does say 3 times he hears about there being a reward and a maiden's hand in marriage. He asks about it, and then he asks again. So, yes, he does want to see God win, but there's also a motivating factor of God, of glory, girls, and a bit of gold in there as well. So, there's a lot of text put to it for me. Anyway, I think the scholars are right. He's for God, but also there's a little extra motivation. A bit of mixed motives. He's a complicated person, as you find out later in the story. Anyway. So, this is where we run into this part of the story. It's in 1 Samuel 17, 38 to 40, and you have it in the handout there. And just to set the scene, David has said, I will go and stand up and do what needs to be done. And Saul said, okay, and trusts him. But Saul has an idea, and he says, you're not really a warrior, you're a shepherd. But if I can give you the right tools and equipment, maybe you can rise up and defeat Goliath. You seem confident. You seem to have people's confidence in you. So maybe this is going to work. So he goes and he puts on the armor. He gives him the equipment. And has anyone seen VeggieTales when they retell this? VeggieTales, in case you're unaware, is where they reimagine the stories but using veggies and fruit and whatever. It's very funny, and it's just got little junior asparagus like loaded up in all this armor where he can't even move. So that's what I imagine when I imagine David. He's got all this equipment on him. Saul's like, now you look like the part. You're going to go. You're going to defeat this thing. What's going to happen here? And David says this, I can't go like this. I can't go like this. I'm not used to this. This is not what I do. These things you put on me, your tunic, your coat of armor, your helmet, all of this stuff here, this is not what I'm used to. And if I go out like this is not going to work. So he receives all of it from Saul, and he says, I can't go out like this. Thank you so much. Thanks for your confidence in me. Much respect, king of this new nation. But this is just not how I roll. This does not fit for what I need to do. So instead, he takes it all off. To which Saul, I'm sure at this point, is like, ooh, like, you don't look like the person who's going to do the thing we need you to do. But he goes out, he gets his staff in his hand, he goes down to the stream, he chooses 5 smooth stones, he puts them in his pouch, he gets his sling in hand, and he approaches the Philistine. He goes up to Goliath. He goes up to him and he gets taunted, and he goes in this big 1-verse-1 match, which seems a little weird now because we don't have kings. And I mean, we do have a king technically, but no one thinks of it in the context that they did. But at the time, it was basically not about so much the kingdom and the kingdom. It was also about who the kingdom stood with. So it was the Israelites were there defending themselves or attacking, depending on the situation. But they were also there representing their God, who led them. And the Philistines had their God who led them and their thing. So this was not just about kingdom and kingdom. There's also a religious element. There's also a cultural element. So when these two went out to verse each other, David with his little sling and his little pouch, and Goliath, big, beefy, big sword, it was a 1 versus 1, nation versus nation, God versus God, culture versus culture showdown, which would have been pretty cool to watch, very intimidating. Great story, not a great time to be alive in many, many ways, but this is what happens. Goliath makes fun of God and he says, this is it. David gets out his sling and his stones and he goes and he says, God is with me, who's going to stand against this? He goes, he slings it at the giant, pings him in the head, he falls down. Now, if you only heard this in Sunday school and you didn't go and read it as an adult, just so you are aware, he doesn't just die from getting the knock in the head, right? What happens next? He goes and chops his head off. Now, they leave that out at Sunday school, which I think is a good thing. Kids, and then he chopped his head off. Why are you all screaming? Just so you know the story, this is the delicate words of the Bible. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the sheath, and after he killed him, he cut off his head. Because that's how you definitively say he's no longer a threat. The head is detached from the body. That's what he did. Brutal warfare. And then after that, the Philistines saw what happened. They saw their big thing go down and they thought to themselves, we are toast. They turn and run. The Israelites come out and all of a sudden they're really courageous. Look at that. From fear to courage. Strange how sometimes it takes a flick of the switch. They go out, they run them down, they kill them. Again, incredible story when you're on the winning team, very brutal warfare. And we've got to also acknowledge the fact that these sort of stories that come to us from the Bible, they come from a time where it just doesn't have the Jesus ethic that 21st century Australia and others have a different ethic for how we operate. And that's what happened. So the point of the story for today is simply this. When David faced Goliath, he was doing so wearing his own clothes. He was comfortable with who he was. He knew who God made him to be. He knew that Saul was trying to put something onto him that he just was not. So when he had this task to do and he had to go and face the giant, he was ready and prepared as himself. There's so many stories you can draw, so many illustrations and points you can draw, but the one thing from it today is simply this. When he was required to act, he acted as himself. He didn't try to be Saul. He didn't try to be his brothers. He didn't try and look at Goliath and think, if you're coming at me with that, I'm going to come back at you the same way. He said, I know who I am. I know who is with me. He knew God was with him. And he went out completely comfortable in his own skin, with his own method, with his own way of doing things. King Saul tried to make him what he wasn't. But David had the strength to stand up and say, this is who I am. And that way is actually not going to work for me. So what I'm offering you today is simply this. There is a way for you to connect with God. And maybe you've explored this before, but maybe you haven't. And Paul has come along and said, hey, if you want to follow Jesus, this is how you do it. And what they've done is they've tried to put on the armor that fits them, and they've tried to put that onto you and say, surely now you can connect with your heavenly Father. And you thought to yourself, this just doesn't fit me. And so what I want you to explore, and if you're a follower of Jesus, what you must explore is figuring out how it is you connect with God. And then we're going to talk about this next week, how we actually put it into practice. So here's what I want you to do. Sometime today, and it's actually really handy, but on the back here is a couple of QR codes. One of them is a spiritual pathways assessment. And what I would love for you to do is log on to that one and have a crack. So it's 5 minutes. It talks about 9 different spiritual pathways. What you do is you answer a question like, do you connect with God here or here? Or, it just has the questions, you rate them. For those of you that get paralyzed by multiple choice, just do the best that you can. I understand that there's technically different ways of answering it and you wish you had like a between the two dots. I get all of that. Just as someone who doesn't suffer from that, I say just get over it. But I understand it is a legitimate paralysis. Just do the best you can. It's not 100% foolproof. But what it will do is help you maybe discover the way that you best connect with God. And next week, we're going to go through each of them, pros, cons, and then how to actually put it into your life. And just in case you're interested, I went and I redid the test again just to check, and I'm still my same ones I've been every time I've redone it. I've done it every 3-ish years, just to sort of see if I've changed, and I've stayed pretty much the same. My top 3 that I am is naturalist. I love being I love doing things and standing up for stuff. And intellectual, podcast, books. Yeah, that's how I connect to God. I look at people sometimes, I'm like, if you could just put the dots together, because as an intellectual, that's how we think. If I showed you the evidence, it's not how everyone thinks, but it's how I think. Those are still my top 3. The 3 that I always struggle with: ascetic, traditionalist, and sensate. So basically, I love to move and be moving, and when I'm still, I die inside. Now, don't get me wrong, as we'll look at next week, you still comfort zone. I have to learn to be silent with God. But here's the point. When you operate far too long outside of the way that God has wired you, it will burn you out. And you'll be stuck there thinking to yourself, why can it work for them, but it doesn't seem to work for me? So why can they sit quietly, and why can they just read, and why can they connect intellectually, and why can they do things that maybe I can't do? And if you operate too long outside of that, what ends up happening to your faith is you think to yourself, maybe I'm just built for Sundays, and maybe I'm just built to occasionally serve or attend a life group. And I believe God has so much more in store for you if you connect with him each and every day. But sometimes we just need the tools to know how to do it. And the first step to getting access to those tools is figure out how is it you connect with God. And maybe it will make some things line up for you. Now, the other resource on here as well is that it will take you to a website, and on that website it has the assessment, and it also has some other resources as well. So if you want to do the book and DVD series, you can do that. It's got a link to something called Right Now Media, which is wired, and you like learning things, to log in and to look at some great resources there. But you can go and check out those 2 things, and hopefully they're helpful. My hope for you, my prayer for all of you, and for everyone, is that anyone who engaged. I pray right now that as we take this test and as we get an opportunity to look at how we connect with you, that you will allow us to see ways to put it into practice, and that as we look at it next week, may you just help line everything up so that we are encouraged to not just see our connection with you as a Sunday thing, but that we shift that into an everyday opportunity. Be with us this week. In your name and for your glory. Amen.